pressure looks good.
Throttling up. Roger, roll with Atlantis.
Water towers can fly! Yes!
Tango down to nominal.
Flight down, SC off. Say again, SC off.
Yikes. You bet. Okay. We don't need any more of these.
Good afternoon. You are looking live at Space Launch Complex 40 at the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where SpaceX is getting ready to launch a Falcon 9 rocket with its first batch of Starlink V2 mini satellites. I am Sawyer Rosenstein and will be your host through the broadcast today, and am joined by our fantastic commentary team, which includes Alejandro Alcantarilla Romero, aka Alex. How's it going, Alex?
I'm doing great. I see all the people at NSF are trying hard to pronounce my name. That's sweet. I'm great. Kind of expecting to see what's going on today on today's mission. We'll see.
Same. And also joining us is Chris Gebhardt from the field. Chris, how's it going?
Going well. How about yourself?
It is going very well, and I see it's going well in chat with all the 5x5s. Appreciate those. So we are preparing for this launch, which I know we're all a little bit tired from yesterday, but we've got that excitement level back up because this is the first batch of V2 Starlink satellites going up today. So Alex, can you give us a little bit of an overview of what that means and what we can expect for this mission?
Yeah, so today is the first launch of these Starlink V2 satellites, and sort of what we've been talking about for a few months and mostly a year is that these will launch on Starship, but today they are being launched on Falcon 9. So what's different? Well, they are called Starlink V2 Mini for a reason, and it's because they are downsized versions of those fully sized Starlink V2 satellites. These are sized for the Falcon 9 fairing. There are going to be 21 of them. You can see there the stack of satellites already in the payload processing facility by SpaceX. And you can see there are also, so I believe the one on the left, the stack of satellites, the one on the left, are the regular Starlink V1.5 satellites that they have been launching so far. And the reason why they're launching these on Falcon 9 instead of, just going with the Starship, it's precisely because the Starship, it's going to take a little while to get there, to get to the point of actually launching a Starlinks. And, we're obviously waiting for that orbital flight, but it won't carry any Starlinks. It won't carry any payload. It won't even be able to deploy anything. And it might be a few ships or flights in general until they can actually do that. So in the meantime, SpaceX is launching these on Falcon 9. But the mini word should not deceive you, because these are big satellites. Like, they occupy the whole diameter of the fairing, and there are stacked there of 21 satellites. Each one is at least 4 times, basically carries more capacity, 4 times more capacity than the earlier satellites. So that means that even though they carry roughly 3 times less satellites on this mission than compared to the ones with the previous version, because they are 4 times more powerful, more capacity they carry into orbit, they are able to basically carry into the Starlink system more bandwidth overall. These satellites also contain new argon Hall effect thrusters instead of the Krypton ones that were based on the previous version as well. So overall, they are much more improved. They introduce new technologies as well, with new frequencies as E-band frequencies, which will backhaul the ones for K-band and Q-band that the current satellites are already using. However, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be any Starlink V1.5 satellites launched anymore. We have another launch, potentially tomorrow, from Vandenberg with another batch of Starlink satellites. There will be more Starlink V1.5 satellites as well. I think I touched on everything so far in terms of the satellites, but then about the Falcon 9 launching on this mission, this booster is B1073. It has launched already 2 times, CRS-26 and OneWeb 16, and it'll be landing on A Shortfall of Gravitas, which will locate about 660 kilometers downrange in the Atlantic Ocean. The fairing halves are also being, you can see there the trajectory, which will go to the southeast, And the fairing halves will be recovered by the multi-purpose recovery vessel Doug. I had it all in front of me, and I was trying to find that.
There you go. All the information you could possibly need there. We should be getting into fueling in the next minute and a half or so. In the meantime, if you have any questions about this mission, you can tag us at NASASpaceflight, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can, including one relating to this particular mission and why it got delayed a couple hours as well. Musical Wolves, our favorite here, with the super chat asking, how is the space weather looking? So, Chris, what's the big deal with space weather on these launches?
Yeah, so many of you probably remember that about a year ago, in February of 2022, SpaceX launched a group of Starlink satellites, and a coronal mass ejection was thrown out from the sun toward Earth. Coronal mass ejection is a big solar storm. And this ejection hit the Earth and caused our atmosphere to thicken as a result, and those Starlink satellites were lost because atmospheric density increased. They were in low orbits to begin with. It increased the drag, and down came something like 40 of the 47 satellites that were launched on that particular mission. So there's that element of it, but that's not actually the issue that was largely in play today, because these particular batches of Starlinks are being thrown into roughly 350-kilometer initial deployment orbits, which is much higher than the 200-kilometer orbit from the ones that were lost a year ago. But radiation and energetic particles can wreak havoc with control and guidance systems, as well as positioning system data and everything like that. And when Falcon 9's window opened today, it was a rather long window that they had to launch this first batch. We were basically in the middle of the storm, in the peak of it. Based on predictions. So likely this was a moment of delaying slightly on the day to really get a better characteristic and categorization of what the charged particle environment was in Leo right now as the storm passes us by, and then a determination that they were in fact okay to lift off today. Um, well, just in
Oh,
case,
apologies about that. There we go. Sorry. Technical issue there. Want
Well,
to
if you want me to talk about one little thing I just heard, the launch auto sequence has started, so propellant load has begun on the Falcon 9.
and indicating exactly what I was just saying
Yep.
there, that everything is hunky dory, as they used to say back in the day, up in space with the space weather. So, space weather. Bit of a concern that they watched, but then overall good. But then you can also see that our actual ground weather and terrestrial weather is also looking absolutely wonderful for liftoff today.
Exactly. And keeping in mind that space weather is just as important as the ground weather itself. So all of those are continually looked at by the range and SpaceX as well. Hitting a few super chats we want to thank here. John Doe, thank you for becoming a PadRat member. Justin Crippen, great last name, thank you for becoming a PadRat member. Wessie the Third, thank you for gifting one Red Team membership. And love the support. Not as big of a fan of the item that you're named after. Ground umbilical carrier plate. Thank you for the Red Team membership. Commander Lord Fathoms with a great question. I'll put this one over to you, Alex. Is there a new fairing size or configuration for these V2s?
Nope, they just basically use the same fairing that they have been using so far. Instead of having to modify the fairings, because that will be way more costly, they just basically downgraded. Well, not downgraded. That probably is not a correct term there. More like downsized. And I don't say downgraded because, in theory, it uses the same technologies that we might see later on with the fully sized Starlink V2s. They just basically made it a little bit smaller, right? Maybe less antennas or something like that. I don't know, but basically a smaller size of the satellite, but overall the same sort of technologies.
So along those lines, Logan Adamson had a great question of what's the difference then between the Starlink V1s or 1.5s and the Starlink V2s?
Yeah, so most of the differences we already touched on them. They include E-band connectivity, for example. It's a new frequency, basically. The thrusters are argon based instead of krypton based. They are larger, obviously. They are more massive. There's only 21 of them on these flights, compared to the usually 50 to 55 of them that fly on the regular Starlink V1.5 launches. And another important difference is that they provide more capability, 4 times more. So even though there are less overall in terms of per launch capacity added to the system, to the Starlink system, they add more in like just by pure trade-off there of less number but more capacity overall. So it's more.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see the capacity. And again, the fact that we're launching fewer satellites on this mission than a typical version 1.5, and yet getting more capability is always exciting and interesting. Gwen with an interesting question here. And Chris, I'm going to pose this one over to you. As this rocket also uses a TTEB ignition system, can you please explain what that is and how it works? Because that was a delaying factor when it came to Crew 6 earlier this morning.
Very much so. So TTAB, let us definitely talk about that. So TTAB is how they it's the igniter material, like the lighter fluid for the Merlin 1D engine. So kerosene, unlike hydrogen, is not like it'll just like kaboom when it interacts with oxygen. So kerosene is very stable in that regard. So they need an ignition source to get that process going. And then once the combustion is up and running, it's stable and it can continue on from there on its own. So there are two types of TTEB that are in play here. There's the TTEB that is used to ignite all 9 Merlin 1D engines on the first stage for liftoff. And then there is the TTAB canisters inside the first stage and second stage to permit the reignition of 3 of the Merlin engines for the entry and landing burn sequences of the booster, and then in the second stage for the ignition of the Merlin 1D vacuum engine after staging. So what happens is basically there are 2 tanks. There's a main tank of TTAB and then another tank that flows into, and it's the second tank that is then used to provide the TTAB to ignite the Merlin engines. And basically something in that ground processing part of this yesterday went wrong at 39A, and there was a bit of a discrepancy as to whether or not they had the amount of TTAB in that second tank needed to actually properly allow for the ignition of the 9 Merlin 1D engines. Not expected to be an issue here today for this particular Falcon 9. Different pad, different system, different everything from 39A. Yes, there are similarities in terms of how they're used, but they are completely separate systems today. So not anticipating an issue with that.
Yes, and let's hope it stays that way and that gets resolved for Crew 6's pad as well in the coming days, which, for those unaware, Crew 6 is currently scheduled for no earlier than Thursday at 12:34 a.m. Eastern Time. Going along with these changes and things that we're seeing with these new satellites, James Scheid asking, are the Starlink satellites in a low enough orbit that argon from thrusters settles back to Earth or is lost in space? And more generally, Alex, why are we using argon as opposed to krypton?
Oh, that's a great question. I guess that can be traced back as to why krypton in the first place. Because usually in the industry, for Hall effect thrusters at least, they use xenon as the propellant for that thruster, or more like the reaction mass, I guess. The initial thought for why they moved to krypton, or more like why in the first place they started with krypton thrusters, was that krypton is widely more available than xenon. If you have a constellation of thousands of satellites, and even if you're loading just a few kilograms, you might end up using tons and tons of xenon. And turns out the world supply is just in terms of tons of xenon rather than thousands or millions of tons of xenon. So you end up with at a point where krypton is more widely available, and even though it might have a little bit of basically less efficiency on the thruster when it works, it's cheaper, more available, so it's overall better. Now, why from Krypton to Argon? Probably the same thought, because now there are more satellites. It's going to be up to 30,000 of them instead of 4,000. So it's going to be like about 7 times more satellites, and having a propellant that is cheaper and even more widely available. Argon is the third most common gas in the atmosphere, obviously counting out water vapor, because that usually changes in location and everything. But yeah, the argon is a very, very cheap gas to get, and very accessible. And in fact, SpaceX owns an Earth separation unit at a Starbase that is potentially capable of separating air into nitrogen, oxygen, and argon. So they might even be able to produce their own argon for these satellites. So it's all advantages in that sense. Why did they not choose argon in the first place? Well, argon is also a little bit harder to work with on a thruster, on a Hall effect thruster, and so it might come down to just that they first probably wanted Krypton first because it was a little bit easier as a sort of middle step. But that's just a conjecture, obviously.
And to
Yeah,
take the first part of that really, really quickly, you are exactly right. 550-kilometer operational, or well, 540 for these generations. The argon that is burned in there and contained in there would either remain in Earth's tensile atmosphere up there, or it would get stripped away by the solar wind at some point and the magnetic field.
exactly. And I can probably take a guess that part of the reason they picked the element is because all the other good ones are gone.
Oh, come on.
I had to. I'm sorry. That was terrible, but gold periodic table jokes.
And also just to hammer it home too, argon is about 100 times less expensive than krypton and about 1,000 times less expensive than xenon. So there's definitely a cost benefit to this as well.
Yeah, and even though there's very little of it loaded into these satellites, like maybe it's in a few dozen of kilograms, maybe a couple of dozen of kilograms, we're talking about 30,000 satellites at the end of the day, right? Once it is deployed, and then they have to be replenished because they have a lifetime of 5 years in orbit, and then they have to be replenished. So we're probably talking about many thousands, like probably bordering hundreds of thousands of satellites in the span of maybe a decade and a half. So that's a lot of tonnage of propellant that you need to use on these satellites. So obviously, if you go for a cheaper one, that is definitely cost saving.
Very good point. And again, don't forget you can ask us your questions by tagging us at NASASpaceflight. And I see all of the boos in chat. I'm sorry. I'll hit a few super chats here really quickly. Bill Moore with a super chat without a message, but we still thank you very much for your support. Moldy Space Industries gifting 5 Red Team memberships, and Tracy gifting 5 Red Team memberships. So if you received one of those gifted memberships, make sure you give them a thank you.
Wow. And well, from me, thank you guys. I didn't get one, but thank you. That means a lot. Thank you.
Here's a question from Roseanne DeVasto asking, has there any concern that's been expressed about the quantity of satellites in orbit? And I know even just last night
yes.
we had space debris concerns even last night, but yeah.
Oh yeah, so where to begin? This is a moment when I wish Jonathan McDowell was on here, but we could have a whole NSF live with that. Yeah, the number of satellites is a concern. Somewhat to astronomers, somewhat to the overall space environment and space debris and potential debris environment that is up there right now. The important thing to remember with the Starlinks is that the vast majority, and by that I mean something like 99.9% of them, are controllable in orbit and they can be controlled to deorbit. But in terms of the number of satellites up there, I mean, yeah, there's concern. Astronomers, space debris, we saw SLS had several cutouts in its launch window trajectories to the moon to avoid certain things like that. And the more that are up there, the more you're going to see those, especially during longer launch windows. But I mean, it is a balancing act between what we feel that we need and how we want to use the space around Earth, and making sure that we don't get ourselves into a potential Kessler syndrome scenario, which is part of it where the more populated and crowded the Earth orbit environment becomes, you open yourself up to a theoretical possibility of one collision then leads to more collisions, and then it sort of exponentially grows from there, and you basically littered the low Earth orbit environment with debris to the point where you can't use it. We're not there. Could we be building toward that? Yeah, but as long as we don't do many of those like Russian anti-satellite tests, not saying others in the US haven't done them either. Russia's just the one that's done it most recently. Um, the more of those types of things that we can avoid, the better off we'll be overall.
Exactly. And of course, this is something that was addressed by the FAA and all the organizations when SpaceX applied for these new Starlink V2s as well. Part of that was debris mitigation and basically even coming to clear the skies out a little bit for astronomers as well, or at least make them a little bit darker. All right, as we take once again a look at the rocket over at Space Launch Complex 40 and the Falcon 9 in Florida, not Texas, but again, you can always watch those feeds live. We'll take a few more questions going on here. Keep an eye, though, on your screen, as in the next minute and a half or so, approximately, we should be seeing a big, giant puff of clouds, which is the T-minus 20-minute vent, which not only indicates that everything is going according to plan with the timeline and fueling, it's also clearing and purging out the lines ahead of loading of more fuels and propellants and oxidizers, because at T-minus 16 minutes is when we will start getting the liquid oxygen loading into that second stage. So we'll keep an eye out for that vent as we take a few more questions here. Let's see. Kind of along the lines of the number of satellites, Mike Smith asking, is there any idea of how many of the V2 minis will be launched in total? Alex, do you want to take that?
Well, they haven't really said how many of these missions they're going to launch. It is also interesting to note that on recent weeks, they've also filed for paperwork related with the first generation, and by the way, that's the T-minus 20-minute vent.
There it is.
I've also heard the call out that stage 2 RP1 load has been completed and strong back chill has begun. So there you go, the T-minus 20-minute vent underway. The paperwork itself was concerning the first generation constellation, and it was saying that they will like to be able to replace the aging satellites. So basically, these satellites, especially the oldest ones, have been launched 4 years ago, and they have a 5-year lifespan. And so what they were saying is that they would like to replace them with newer technology satellites. Was their name of choice for that. And what it implies is that they might want to launch these Starlink V2 minis, but to the older constellation. And that creates a whole confusion because, it's 2 different constellations, different satellite versions and all that. But at the end of the day, it just comes down to them just wanting to replace what is old and bring up new capabilities. It is possible that because of this, Falcon 9 might be launching for quite a while these replacement satellites, and then maybe it'll be the task of a Starship to completely replace all of the satellites and completely launch everything as well. But in the meantime, they seem to be taking quite a good use of this rocket.
Oh, that is for sure. They are definitely taking some good use out of it. And I guess something old, something new, something borrowed, and something low Earth orbit. Here's a good question as we take a look at the rocket and the gorgeous sky behind it. Delta 23 with a simple question. Chris, over to you. Jellyfish or gnaw?
Most likely nah today. Liftoff is currently planned for roughly 7.5 minutes prior to sunset. We normally do not see jellyfishes when the sun is above the horizon.
Yeah, it's close. The 8 minutes before, not after, but very close. It should still put on a gorgeous show because the weather there, not many clouds in the sky, it seems like, right?
High altitude cirrus, but nothing major.
Like hearing that. Like hearing good weather. Let's see. I'll send this one over to you, Alex. John Gomez asking, will SpaceX ever use the XL fairing? Which there was plans for a slightly larger fairing at one point, right?
Yeah, that is a longer fairing, and it probably will be used for the launch of the first pieces of Gateway on a Falcon Heavy rocket. Mostly because of the size of the whole stack during launch configuration. It's too long to fit inside the regular fairing, and so that will probably be used for that mission. Now, we don't know any other missions that might need it yet. Like, we don't know yet. We might not in the future, but so far we don't know. What's definitely sure is that it doesn't seem like they're using that on Starlink. We've been asked many times whether they will use, Falcon Heavy and put longer fairing, and that way they can carry more satellites. The problem with that is that it's probably not economical to be able to, like, from a money perspective, it's probably not good to be producing new types of fairings that they don't fly on the other flights, because they already have a process for refurbishment and processing, basically recovery, refurbishment, processing, and then use on these fairing missions. And so they can use those on commercial missions, like, we have had Amazonas and Inmarsat lately. All of those missions used fairings. So from a money perspective, it might not make sense to actually do that, because at the end of the day, you might be launching more per launch, but also you might be losing money somewhere else. And so this seems to be right now the optimal configuration for them. And we'll see. They have definitely tried to launch more just by changing the performance of the rocket, but definitely not the fairing size itself.
Yes, and with that vent stopped as we pass the T-minus 16-minute mark, that should be a good indication that second stage LOX loading, or liquid oxygen loading, is underway, continuing our countdown towards liftoff. Here's a question that I'm not sure we know the exact answer to, but I'll add a follow-up to it for you, Chris. They're asking, do the Mini V2 launches have space for a Starshield payload? Now, I'm not sure we know the answer to that exactly, but can you explain a little bit to those who don't know what Starshield is?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, Starshield is basically a satellite prototype for the military. So it's Starlink satellite internet tech for the government. So that is what the overall Starshield program is. So if you sort of think about it like what the Starlinks are being, we see how Starlinks are being used in Ukraine right now, with the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian civilians, and everything like that. So think of it like that, but for U.S. military needs. So the big U.S. military communication satellites that go up there, they're the big ones that are used, but the military also can utilize these low Earth orbit, low latency satellite networks for real-time command operations as well. And that's a lot of what the Starshield element is for the overall part of SpaceX. Now, exactly when they will start launching is a bit nebulous. Is it possible that there's components that will be on them that are on these as well? Yes. Is it possible there could be co-manifested payloads and we don't really know when the star shields are going up? Completely possible on that, but I don't. But I don't have any information as to would they ride share with the Mini V2s or not.
That is a really good question, though. Thank you.
Really good, yeah.
Yeah. Let's hit a few super chats. A very generous super chat here from BC, who has the interesting question of why not use nitrogen as opposed to argon. I don't know if either of you know the answer to that one.
Okay, so I'm not a chemist, but I will guess that while nitrogen is more readily available, it's probably, in the case at least of nitrogen, it also has basically the chemistry has a triple bond between its molecules, but not between the molecules, between the atoms of the molecules, whereas argon is free atoms. That's usually common for noble gases, and it's probably not unheard of. I'm sure there's probably some company there that has made some nitrogen ion thruster or something like that, but definitely not Hall effect thrusters. And the issue with breaking those bonds is precisely being able to give the energy to the atoms so they can be then expelled out of the ion thruster. It's very complicated to explain in like a 2-minute kind of answer, but it's sort of along those lines that it's also why xenon it's more widely used, because it's a larger atom. It's usually way easier to ionize it to be able to then throw it out of the ion engine. That it's why it's used more commonly, and why krypton and argon are less common. So yeah, that's sort of along those lines.
What do they mean, by the way, when they're talking about a Hall effect thruster?
Okay, now that you go into something that we'll probably need a whole video about that.
Fair enough.
Yeah, quantum stuff.
There you go. Chrome Penguin also with the support, saying, took the day off to watch the Crew 6 launch and bummed it scrubbed. Happy to, hopefully, see a great launch covered by the best group on and off the stream. And that really means a lot. Thank you very, very much for those kind words. Really do appreciate that. All right, let's see. Another question that we've got here from Nifty Satsuma asking, how do the separation mechanics work? There's no explosion or springs. Does it use the drag on the booster for the second stage to slide out? Chris, I know there may be a lot of tension answering this one, but...
Springs is the answer. Falcon 9 separation system is basically springs.
Well, for the separation between the first and second stages in particular, it is pneumatics. I believe they were probably answering like
is there a pusher?
Yeah, there are pushers. There are 3 pushers on the intrastage and 1 on the center that pushes on the MVAC engine. You can see that sometimes in the shots from inside the intrastage as well.
Exactly. Which, speaking of separation, once it does separate, you have the first stage that is going to then come back and land, as we mentioned, on the drone ship in the Atlantic Ocean, just to the southeast, which, in case you're wondering how that works in terms of which engines are used and which ones fire, we have a shirt and some other merch that can help you remember in our launch, entry, and landing gear. It has the display of which engines are used for launch, all 9 of them, the 3 for the entry burn, and of course the single engine for landing. You can get that on shirts, mugs, sweatshirts, all of your favorite items. These are all available at shop.nasaspaceflight.com. And this is personally one of my favorite items that we've had in the shop. I just think it's just really cool. Again, I'm also a Falcon 9 geek, but yes.
I mean, I myself as a Falcon lover, I gotta say, even the entry, basically the diagram there of which engines are ignited. If you were to look at the booster when horizontal on the pad, those are the engines that actually ignite. It's not like 3 random engines. It's actually engine 1, engine 5, and engine 9. Engine 9 is the center one, but then engine 1 and 5 are those 2 on the outside ring of 8 engines, and it's very much those 2. So I really like that is even to that kind of detail, that even the entry burn is also that kind of detail. So definitely get it if you want to remember all those little things related with the launch of Falcon 9 and its recovery.
Which, fun fact for this mission, pending a successful drone ship landing, SpaceX would have recovered as many boosters at sea as there were space shuttle launches. So this would be their 135th recovery at sea. Just fun fact there. And I believe, if the spreadsheets are correct, that this would also be the 100th consecutive successful landing on both land and sea of the Falcon 9 first stages since the previous anomaly.
Indeed.
Yes. So a lot of good stuff there. A lot of exciting things as we get in towards the final part of the count here. In just about a minute from now, we will expect engine chill prior to liftoff, which you start running those propellants through the engine bells to get them primed and ready for when they are ignited at T-minus 3 seconds. Here's a question in terms of turnaround time. Will today be a first for SpaceX in attempting to launch twice on the same day, even though Crew 6 is rescheduled, which, even though the question says tonight, it's currently rescheduled for Thursday. But had they gone, would we have seen a record? And I believe the answer to that is no, correct? They've done it in a single day.
Yeah, they have already launched multiple times under a single day. It's not being a lot of times, but it's definitely being frequent enough that, beating their own record is going to be hard. Right now, the record is at 7 hours and 10 minutes between Crew 5 and Starlink 4-29. So that's going to be quite hard to beat.
It is, but knowing SpaceX, they will find a way to do it at this point. Let's see. We've got a question here from Jeff Knutson asking, does SpaceX have any sort of engine rotation program so they're not overlighting the same engines across multiple launches? I guess it comes down to how they refurbish and get these boosters ready to fly again. And I'm not sure we know exactly of how many of these engines are refurbished versus swapped out between flights, do we exactly, Alex?
It's really complicated to know about that because they really don't give a lot of information about those minutiae of like, this is the booster, that got X engine replaced, and and then engine components might also be replaced as well or changed from one booster to the other. So it's definitely hard to actually track down these things.
Exactly. And as we get closer to launch here, we're going to let Chris Gebhardt out in the field take care of crewing the cameras, and getting us some of those gorgeous views that we will see during launch. In addition to support from, I apologize for not mentioning at the start, Michael Baylor, who's operating everything behind the scenes, as well as tracking cameras that we will be using during this flight.
Indeed, I will see you all on the other side after launch.
Sounds good. I am a meme, which I hope I don't become one for saying that, asking, how does Falcon 9 ignite the engines if it's in free fall, so during the entry burns and landing? And if it is in free fall, do they use RCS thrusters to settle the fuel, or do they have header tanks? Alex.
Ooh, that will be a very long video, but I'll try to make it short. Basically, in free fall, when it is in space, they use thrusters for settling. And then when it is on re-entry burn, they use both the thrusters and also the atmosphere is already discernible. So basically there's already a little bit of slowing down there from the atmosphere already, enough to settle the propellants on the booster.
Indeed. Here's another question then, which we should be able to answer as well. Will the fairings get recovered by a shortfall of gravitas? And it is
no.
It is not that specifically, right?
Yeah.
It is.
That is the that's basically the drone ship where the booster lands, but not necessarily where they recover the fairing halves.
Right, and like we've talked about, there is usually a ship that goes with them out to sea, and that will be used to get the parachutes the fairings after they parachute into the Atlantic Ocean. And I believe the ship doing that today is Doug. Now we should be coming up here on the TE, retracting a little bit away from the vehicle. You can see those clamps are now out away from those fairing halves that we were just talking about, and it leans back ever so slightly, talking about 1.5 degrees basically, to its pre-launch position now, and then it will completely swing back and away from the vehicle as we hit T-0. So in the meantime, as we are getting into the final 3.5 minutes here, what can we expect to happen before these engines light up, Alex?
Yeah, so right now they're wrapping up propellant load onto the first and second stages. After that, they're going to close out all of the pipes in the strom bag and the launch mount and everything. They're going to be going into what is called startup at T-minus 1 minute. That is when the onboard computers take control of the countdown from the ground computers. T-minus 3 seconds, then the engines will be commanded for ignition, and then we'll hopefully might see that launch. Prior to that, though, we'll also hopefully see the launch director calling for a go for launch as well.
Yeah, that is kind of important, is getting that official go for launch, which we usually get that around T-minus 45 seconds or so, is when we get that official call out.
I've just heard that stage 1 looks load is complete, so the first stage is already loaded with propellants. Next should be the second stage.
Great, we should be getting to that again as well momentarily here. And one quick question that we'll hit as we get into the final part of the count. Do any of the fairings have names, Deadly ATW is asking? And I don't think they've started naming them yet. So, as cool as the names are for the ships and the vessels and the ASDS, not yet for the fairings. As mentioned, we are coming up here on the final 2 minutes of the countdown, so the next call out that we should be getting after the Stage 2 loading is complete will be Falcon 9 going into startup, and that's when the onboard computers will take over control of the entire flight.
And Stage 2 lux load has completed. Now we shall see some venting there from the strom bag as they clean out and purge and clear out all the lines on the strom bag ahead of liftoff.
And there it is.
We shall be coming up soon. Yeah, we shall be coming up now soon on that change to the onboard computers controlling the countdown.
As we get a quick look at A Shortfall of Gravitas.
A Shortfall of Gravitas. Hi, how are you doing?
Again, for those wondering, that is located to the southeast of the launch site tonight. So it will be going southeasterly. So keep an eye out if you live anywhere along the Palm Beach County, Fort Lauderdale, Miami areas in Florida as it goes southward. We are in startup, and we should be getting the go for launch momentarily. We are keeping an ear on that from Mission Control.
And go for launch.
There we go. That's the call we're looking for as we enter the final 30 seconds of the count here. A reminder, the engines will ignite at T-minus 3 seconds, and then we should see it lift off 3 seconds after that, obviously. So we will keep an eye for a green flash at the bottom of the rocket. That is the T-tab that will help ignite the 9 Merlin 1D engines ahead of liftoff, and that will power Falcon 9 through this first part of flight. We are standing by for the flash and the ignition. And there we go. We have ignition and liftoff of Falcon 9 carrying the first Starlink V2 mini satellites on a major constellation. And it has cleared those towers. We will let you listen to the launch audio as it hits our microphones at the press site. If you listen closely, you can hear the sound vibrations rattling the panels on the vehicle assembly building, a little sonic screech, as we like to call it, as we are approaching max Q, the maximum dynamic pressure that is exerted on the vehicle during launch, as we have our tracking cameras following liftoff here. So the next thing that we will keep an eye on as it passes through max Q here is in about 45 seconds from now, a bunch of events happening in quick succession. That would be MECO, or main engine cutoff, on the first stage, followed by the first and second stages separating, and then the second stage engines igniting. And you can see the 9 engines plumes expanding as it gets higher in the atmosphere. It has nothing to do with the amount of thrust being output. It all has to do with the density of Earth's atmosphere. Getting some gorgeous views here, Alex.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And again, fantastic tracking work from all of our teams, from Chris to Michael here. Yeah, we're about 15 seconds away from Miko. It's gorgeous seeing the setting sun as it hits it, and there you can see the glow of the Earth right behind that first stage. Standing by for Miko.
Yeah, that's the center pusher.
That's where this
And
is about.
Miko. Off it goes.
There's first stage, second stage SEP, and ignition of the second stage Merlin vacuum or MVAC engine.
Now, really shortly, fairing separation will occur as well.
Yep, we should be seeing that happening in about 10 seconds or so. That's what's been protecting the 21 Starlink V2 satellites on board. Look at that. You can even see the first stage in that tracking shot there. That was gorgeous. And as we look inside the fairings, we should see those separate momentarily. And there they go. Once again, those will parachute down to be recovered.
That's... Oh boy.
Wow, that is the fairings in there as well. That was a ground view of first, second stage, and the fairings.
Yeah.
Amazing tracking work again and camera work by Michael and Chris here. So again, on the left, you will see the telemetry or the data from that first stage, which you can see it's starting to slow down, the altitude increasing as it reaches its apogee before it then starts descending again towards the drone ship. And meanwhile, the data on the right shows the second stage continuing its climb to orbit as it reaches, I believe, about 28,000 kilometers per hour. And there we go on the left. It looks like the altitude is just about settling out. So that means that will reach its apogee and begin its descent, which we will see the first entry burn happen on that first stage in about a minute and a half.
You may see there are a lot of eyes coming out of the booster. That is totally normal. That is expected. You can see also those flashes from the thrusters as it maneuvers into an engine first position for entry.
Exactly. You can also see the grid fins there, which will be used as it gets deeper into the atmosphere to help it steer itself towards a shortfall of gravitas and hopefully land right on the X on the deck. And everything looking like it's proceeding exactly as planned so far on this first Starlink V2 mini mission. So as I mentioned, we should see that first stage entry burn lighting 3 of those engines in about a minute from now, and that burn will last 19 seconds, and that will basically use fire to slow itself down. That's one of my favorite facts, is how that entry burn works, Alex. You're continuing to see, again, those thrusters that are helping to orient the vehicle, as Alex mentioned just a short moment ago. Meanwhile, the second stage appears to be continuing exactly on its trajectory as planned. You can see that Merlin vacuum or MVAC engine working on the right side there.
Now, Sawyer, I have a trivia question for you coming up here. There's an entry burn. Which engines ignite during the entry burn?
Oh, geez. Is it 159?
Yep, 1, 5, and 9. There you go. Should be first the center engine, the E9, and then the E1 and E5 engines come later. So you will see here in a second there.
There's the T-type flash, and there is
one
the
engine.
entry burn.
And there goes the other 2 engines. Oh, look at that.
Well, we have a view from the ground of it. Chris G catching that. Amazing, still seeing that. And you can see the speed rapidly decreasing now on that stage 1 telemetry. And it looks like the burn is complete. And in case you're wondering why the boosters look so black and sooty afterwards, That was your reason right there. You see it flying through its own dust cloud, basically, its own exhaust cloud, and it's carbon-based, so you get the soot. So now we will look for the Stage 1 landing burn, which will start in about a minute from now, followed by the first stage hopefully landing. And about 15 seconds after landing, we are expecting SECO 1, or second engine cutoff, second stage engine cutoff. So right now we are taking a look. There we go. Now we can see both of them again. Again, second stage on the right, first stage on the left, nearing the drone ship, A Shortfall of Gravitas.
It would be awesome here, right on the Terminator, between light and day. Well, between night and day. Excuse me.
Light and dark, night and day, same difference. It's fine.
I think you can kind of see the drone ship through the left grid fin there.
Oh, you kind of can. And a reminder, it initially steers itself just off to the side of the drone ship. In case there is an anomaly, it will crash into the ocean and not damage the top of the drone ship. But once everything is good, you'll see it steer itself towards the drone ship with those grid fins. Which we have that final landing burn ignition. There's the view from on board. Landing leg deploy. And for the 100th time in a row, SpaceX has now successfully landed a booster to be recovered. That is unbelievable. Always exciting to see that view.
Looky there.
Wow. And at the same time, we should be
That
coming up
sunset was
on MECO.
amazing.
Or on SECO, excuse me.
And looks like we hit that at a good velocity, too.
Yep, right around where it should be. Beautiful. So while we have you back on...
insertion called out as well.
Love hearing that. So Chris, while we have you, how was that liftoff?
It was good. You know, it's one of those interesting moments. Every single liftoff is slightly different based on the local weather setups on the day. And this was actually one of those moments where the higher wind that we were experiencing here today blew the sound very quickly away from us after it overtook us. So it was a quieter launch, actually, than it normally is today.
Interesting, but I still heard the sonic vibrations, I think, from the vehicle.
Oh gosh, yes. The VAB did its squeal of happiness, yes.
Yes, if we don't get the Chris G squeal, we get the VAB squeal. There is that look.
That was a good one.
There is the look at the VAB right now, by the way.
Indeed. And you can see the gorgeous sunset that it was, and the two launch pads here, one with the crew vehicle on it for Thursday morning, and a nice empty launch pad having just launched the first mini Starlink V2 satellites.
Exactly.
Good day.
DOS would love half of the screen right now.
Yes, only a 50% from DOS, right? He would prefer two happy empty launch pads, yes.
Agreed. I think all of us would, but then again, you take the time to do it right. Which is why we have these windows and these backup opportunities. But there we go. That is 100 successful landings, including Falcon 9s and Falcon Heavies landed both on land and on drone ships.
You know, a little bit of trivia here. The most successful launches in a row by a rocket in the US is Falcon 9, but the second one, it is Delta II, and it retired at 100 launches successfully in a row. This is 100 landings successfully in a row. So just you can imagine here the perspective of how things change, where even the landings are as reliable as the launches.
Yeah, I think second place for landing and flying again in a row has to go to Space Shuttle, but that's because that pretty much was the only other choice.
Yeah, for landing, obviously.
Do want to hit a few quick super chats that we have here from before and during liftoff. I'd rather be flying an X-Wing, asking, MVAC is open cycle, right? Where is the turboprop exhaust? I'm not sure if either of you know the answer to that one. Whoever wants to take it.
the turbopump exhaust is basically put out by a different port on the octaweb for each engine. You might see that if you see a booster horizontal if you look up into the engine section.
There we go. And then Juhani trying to trip me up here, so let's see how we do. Asking, how much stars could a starship ship if a starship could ship stars? Whew. 42.
That's a good one, right?
Thankfully, I survived the tongue twister. I think that's the perfect way to wrap it up before I wrap my tongue in more circles with trying to say these. So thank you to everybody who helped out here today. Thank you to Alex for the studio commentary. Thank you, Alex.
My pleasure. Always great to be here for more launches.
Absolutely. And thank you as well for all of your field ops and fantastic tracking work and commentary and everything else you do for this site here, Chris Gebhardt.
If you can hear me over the helicopter, yes, I heard you. My pleasure.
We can hear you loud and clear. And a big thank you again as well to Michael Baylor, who's been pulling the levers, pushing the buttons, and making sure the tracking cameras track. And they've worked phenomenally. And again, fantastic views. Thank you, Michael. I am Sawyer Rosenstein. Thank you all for joining us here for another live launch from NASASpaceflight. And in the words of some of the fantastic people here, later, nerds. Don't forget, you can keep up with everything going on 24/7 at the Kennedy Space Center and Space Force Station on our Space Coast Live 24/7 cameras, which we'll send you over there after this stream.
Liftoff. Propulsion continues to be nominal.
RCP chamber pressure looks good. Toggling up. Roger, roll, Atlantis.
Water towers can fly! Yes!
Tango down to nominal.
Flight down, try SCE off. Say again, SCE off.
Yikes. You bet. Concur. We don't need any more of these.